Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Today, I'm going to take a look at 10 rock and metal bands whose best album is their debut record. Did these bands peak on their debut album? These are in no particular order, but let's get things started here with Acid Bath and their debut record from 1994, When the Kite String Pops. You know, the story of Acid Bath is a pretty tragic one. You know, they were only around for about 6 years before breaking up following the death of bassist Audie Pitre, and they released only 2 studio albums, that being When the Kite String Pops and Pagan Terrorism Tactics. 2 fantastic records here, and it's hard to understate just how influential their debut album was to, you know, the sludge metal subgenre and that whole scene at the time. So many great tracks on this record, right, with a lot of really interesting lyrics, erratic time changes, and super doomy riffs, you know, and they remind me a bit in places of Alice in Chains, which I thought was kind of cool, and I think the evolution of their sound could have been really interesting to hear, but unfortunately they've been largely inactive for decades, but now are reuniting for some one-off festival gigs, and I made a bold prediction at the beginning of the year. I said I wanted new Acid Bath in 2025, and don't we all, right? But a guy can dream. I doubt it's going to happen, but I know Dax Riggs has been writing some stuff for a solo project, so I thought maybe if he's in the studio and Acid Bath are back together, maybe we might get something. I highly doubt it, though, but still wanted to throw that out there, and I don't think Acid Bath are a case of a band peaking on their debut, but rather not having a proper chance to top it. Next up, Skid Row. You know, Skid Row are a band that I always felt could have been bigger in the long run, you know, should have been so much bigger as far as I'm concerned, but they started off hot with one of the last really great hair metal albums of the 80s, that being their self-titled debut. If you can even really call it hair metal, it's pretty heavy, but they followed it up in 1991 with Slave to the Grind, a much heavier record. I really enjoy that one as well, but I think their debut is still their best album. It holds up to this day, you know, with some great rockers on here. You know, you have some awesome tracks like Big Guns, Piece of Me, 18 in Life, Making a Mess, I Remember You, fantastic ballad, you know, so when it comes down to it, this is definitely Skid Row in their prime, at their best. Sebastian Bach was nearly untouchable at this point, one of the best vocalists in the scene by, you know, 1989 or so, and this record definitely gives off Appetite for Destruction vibes for me, you know. I think, you know, the early energy here on this record definitely does remind me of the early energy of, you know, young GNR. It's just a shame that, you know, their success was not, you know, as sustained as GNR, to say the least, right, as the grunge and alternative movement would take over. And I dig Subhuman Race as well, you know, but after that you have the departure of Bach, you have the 1999 reformation, a bunch of different vocalists since then, and they seem to have finally, you know, landed back on their feet with the Gangs All Here, with new vocalist Eric Grunwald, and then of course he left the band, leaving them back to square one. Financially, it's probably in their best interest at this point to just reunite with Bach, right? Maybe jump on a stadium tour with Motley Crue, open for them or something, but nobody seems to be able to stand working with him. You know, both parties are still coasting on the success of their debut album, and what's funny is, you know, whenever I go to a garage sale that's advertising rock CDs or a record expo, everyone is selling this album. It's like everyone bought it when it first came out, and now everyone can't wait to get rid of it. Next up, I'm going to go with Ace Frehley here, and his 1978 solo album in particular. You know, this is just about everyone's favorite Kiss solo record from 78 here, and the beginning of Ace's solo catalog as well, which would have the most success of any other members of Kiss outside of the band. And if you want to get super technical and say, well, this is technically a part of the Kiss catalog and not, you know, his solo catalog, you know, from after Kiss, that's fine. You know, you can definitely swap this out with the first Frehley's Comet album as well. Both are great records, but, you know, back to the 78 album here in particular, the guitar work is stellar. Ace, you know, despite never being a great singer, sounds fantastic here, produced by Eddie Kramer. You have Anton Fig on the drums, who'd later do some session work for Kiss on Dynasty and Unmasked. And, you know, this is full of absolute classic Ace Frehley solo tracks on here, like Rip It Out, Speeding Back to My Baby, Snowblind, Ozone, New York Groove, of course, the classic cover there, Fractured Mirror, great way to close it out, Wiped Out as well as a fun song, and so they're all, you know, really catchy tracks on here. It's full of, you know, that Kiss sound that I think is missing on those other solo albums, even though I do enjoy the individuality of each record in that respect, but every Ace solo album seems to follow a similar formula. You know, they're all fun, guitar-centric records, but as far as I'm concerned, this remains his best work all these years later. Coming up next, I'm going to go with Iggy Pop and the Idiot. Iggy Pop did, in my opinion, his best work early on in his solo career with David Bowie working alongside him, and although I love his latest record, and I might be the only one who enjoys Avenue B, there's no doubt that his best work is on his first 2 albums, The Idiot and Lust for Life, specifically on The Idiot, which I think is stronger, and, you know, this is Bowie and Iggy Pop getting sober during Bowie's Berlin Trilogy era, and Iggy took a more subdued approach than on his previous work with the Stooges, collaborating with Bowie on a more electronic-driven sound here. 2 great results, you know, with standouts on this record like Sister Midnight, Night Clubbing, let's see, China Girl, fantastic. I also love Bowie's version on Let's Dance, Mass Production, Dum Dum Boys. So a lot of really great songs on this record, and I don't think it's a knock on Iggy to say that his best work was done, with David Bowie collaborating with him, but look at it this way. It's like a baseball player taking steroids. Of course they're going to have their best stats that season. Time for one of the most underrated thrash metal bands and underrated thrash metal debuts of all time here. I'm talking about Spectrum of Death by Morbid Saint. Morbid Saint never really had a chance to flesh out their catalog, unlike a lot of the bands on this list. After this album, we didn't get another full-length Morbid Saint record until they finally released their second album, Destruction System, in its entirety in 2015, and last year they released an Album of the Year candidate, in my opinion, with Swallowed by Hell, their first album of all new material in 30 years, but Spectrum of Death is still the best album they released, in my opinion. I think it's aged really well compared to a lot of other thrash metal records, and, I think the other two albums, while, having some great stuff, and specifically Swallowed by Hell, is phenomenal, but they're not able to quite match the breakneck speed and abrasiveness of Spectrum of Death, that put them on the level immediately of a band like Slayer or Creator. Released in 1989, this was a late contender for one of the best thrash metal albums of the decade, and it really sucks that their catalog, could have been so much more, but unfortunately it wasn't. They didn't do all that much. This record had a definite influence on blackened thrash and death metal, and it would have been really interesting to hear the natural evolution of their sound over the years, and had they continued making music in the 90s and 2000s, that would have been a really cool thing, but I guess we can all just be glad that they're back now. Is it harsh to call Meatloaf a one-album wonder? I mean, the guy had a tremendous voice, and he made 12 solo albums, but the only one people seem to remember is Bad Outta Hell, and, for good reason. Bad Outta Hell is a classic album here. Great from beginning to end. It's full of radio hits and really fun tracks. It has great energy, too. It's just an infectious album, and Meatloaf really caught lightning in a bottle here, I think, with his debut solo album from 1977, and the rest of his solo catalog is alright. It has some great moments, but is nowhere near the level of Bad Outta Hell, and he tried to recreate it twice with Bad Outta Hell 2 and 3, respectively in 1993 and 2006, and neither are as good as the original. Album sequels usually aren't. 2 has some memorable moments, but is not on par with his debut from 77, and so for me, is Meatloaf a one-album wonder? I guess it depends on your definition of that. He has some great stuff after this, but nothing that quite matches up to his debut. Going back to thrash metal here, I'm going to go with Exodus and Bonded by Blood. Phenomenal debut album, and Exodus have a great catalog. It's just, how do you top the greatest thrash metal debut album of all time? It's next to impossible, right? And this record also stands out as the only full-length album to feature Paul Bailoff on lead vocals, and after this record, the band will bring in Zetro Souza and do some incredible work over the years, but nothing quite on the level of Bonded by Blood, in my opinion. And they tried to recreate that magic years later with Rob Dukes and Let There Be Blood. Personally, I'm not a fan of that project. I think they should have left a perfect record alone, but nonetheless, nothing touches the original here, Bonded by Blood. Fantastic stuff, and Exodus have a great catalog, but their debut album is in a class of its own. How about Boston? Their self-titled debut album. If I were ranking the studio albums of Boston, I'd probably rank them in order in which they were released, although Third Stage might be a little bit higher than Don't Look Back for me, but the band were never able to top their self-titled debut from 1976. Of course, we've all heard, More Than a Feeling and Smokin' to Death on classic rock radio, although I really like the lyrics on More Than a Feeling, and probably never need to hear it again, though. Otherwise, this is still a great 10 out of 10 album. Every song on here is fantastic. The hooks on this album are massive, and, it make it impossible not to get caught up in this record, and tracks like Peace of Mind, Rock and Roll Band, Something About You, and Let Me Take You Home Tonight, the only track written on the record solely by Brad Delp. Otherwise, Tom Scholz is totally in his element here, playing virtually every instrument on the record and engineered all of the tracks. But for an album that turns 50 next year, it feels current, it doesn't sound dated at all, it's a vibrant and fun record, and one of the defining arena rock albums of the 70s for sure. Let's talk about Circus of Power. Talk about a great band that just kind of fell off the face of the earth after their debut album. Self-titled, fantastic record, definitely worth checking out. A really unique blend of sleaze metal with kind of a raw AC/DC type of sound, and that debut has a really gritty feel to it that translated really well live as well, with this great live album here from 1989 entitled Still Alive. There's some fantastic stuff here, and after that, their second album wasn't as good, but they managed to land a gig opening for Black Sabbath on the tour for 1990's Tear, and the band released Magic and Madness in 1993, also not on the level of their debut, and around that same time, they would fall victim to, the grunge takeover of the early 90s. They have 4 albums in total and still play sporadically, but as far as I'm concerned, their self-titled debut is top shelf material, and the rest isn't nearly as memorable or up to par, but their debut, definitely check it out. It's very underrated stuff, definitely worth a listen, as is this live EP. And lastly here, this is probably the first one that came to mind for a lot of people. It's definitely the first that came to mind for me. That's Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. As big and successful as GNR became, you can't help but look at their catalog and think, what could have been, right? Appetite was a white-hot start, and it was going to be next to impossible to top it. Use Your Illusion shouldn't have been 2 records, but I think even if you put the best material from both of those records into one, it doesn't match the raw aggression on their debut. And then, of course, things started to fall apart, right? Axl tried to keep the band going for years. We got the Chinese Democracy debacle, right now reunited with Slash and Duff once again, but we've gotten only, a few singles, which are just Chinese Democracy leftovers, and, the one-off EP here and there, and that's pretty much it. No new albums in over 15 years, nothing substantial, just a revolving door of dysfunction and disappointment, and I think what could have been, in terms of their output. And I'm not saying Appetite would have been an easy album to top by any means, but you'd think they were on trajectory to be the next Rolling Stones, and unfortunately the rest of their studio catalog is a complete letdown compared to how hot they started, but it is a testament to how strong this record is. They've been able to coast on it for, nearly 40 years now. Tremendous stuff on here, right? This is all-time GNR material, and of course, recently they parted ways with their longtime drummer. I was hoping that they would reunite with Steven Adler. That did not happen. That would have been great, but like GNR have been saying, what you want and what you get are 2 completely different things, and so, yeah, we as GNR fans continue to be starved of proper new material, and nothing that comes close to what they did with Appetite here, this groundbreaking debut album from 1987. So that wraps up this rant video here, taking a look at 10 rock and metal bands whose debut album is their best record. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my picks. You can see them right over here. And, do you feel like these bands peaked on their debut album, and what are some other favorite albums of yours from these bands? I definitely want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CG guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.